Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's District Administration Web Seminar, which is entitled Creating Expert Reading Teachers is Rocket Science, which is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, Voyager Sopris Learning. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to share just a few housekeeping items with you, and then we'll get right on to it. For technical supports, please use the chat panel, which you can find on the right side of your screen. Then select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and then type your message to me if you're having any technical issues, and I should get back to you shortly. If you currently don't have computer speakers, or maybe you prefer to listen privately, just please dial the phone number and access code that I will be posting in the chat window in a few moments, so make sure to look for that. We will also be welcoming any questions you have today with the Q&A session that will take place at the end of the presentation. To submit a question, please use the Q&A panel, which you can find at the lower right side of your screen, then send your questions to all panelists. If you don't currently see the chat or the Q&A panels, again, look to the right side of your screen, then click on what should look like an expand triangle, and that should be located directly in front of the panel name to make sure you have access to it. Also, last thing I'll mention before we get started, something important to note. If you would like to access the web seminar at a later time, everyone who is registered and who is attending today will receive an email with a link to the slide as well as an archive recording. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand things off to the facilitator of today's event, Lori Kirkstead, who is the Senior Manager of Content Marketing over at Voyager Sopris Learning. Hi, Lori. Great to have you with us.
Hi. Thank you for having us. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. As Stephen said, my name is Lori Kirkstead, and I'll be introducing our speaker as well as moderating the Q&A at the end of this presentation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Stoller. As the creator of the Reading Science Academy, Dr. Stoller understands the critical importance of embracing the science of reading and has brought a wealth of knowledge in this area to each of her roles throughout her career, including providing science of reading-based professional learning for teachers for the past 25 years. Stephanie has worked as an educational consultant, a school psychologist, and an assistant professor in the school psychology program at the University of South Florida, is the former vice president for professional learning at Acadience Learning, and is also a founding member of a national alliance for supporting reading science in higher education. Additionally, she has conducted research in the areas of assessment, early intervention, and collaborative problem solving, and as a member of the board for the Innovations in Education Consortium, that can be a mouthful sometimes, she collaboratively plans the annual MTSS Innovations in Education Conference. She is currently an adjunct professor in the online reading science program at Mount St. Joseph University. So without any further ado and introduction, I'd like to turn it over today to Dr. Stoller for today's presentation.
Thanks so much, Lori. I appreciate that introduction. And thank you to Stephen for your support in the session today. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for devoting some time out of your day to talk a little bit about how administrators can specifically support teachers to be rocket scientists when it comes to reading instruction. That title comes from Dr. Louisa Moat's famous paper that you can find. I'm going to give you the link to that on the American Federation of Teachers website, where she's really highlighting what teachers need to know and be able to do to be experts at teaching reading. This is an ongoing process and journey that teachers are on. And I want to try today to give you some ideas and some things to think about in your role as administrators, supporting teachers with that high level of knowledge and supporting students to become better readers through the intervention programs that you make available through your districts and schools. So I'm going to focus on three sort of areas, helping you to think about selecting interventions, so what to look for when you're making those choices, thinking about matching the needs of your students, so getting that match between the high quality instructional and intervention materials and the needs of your students. And then also thinking about setting the stage, getting the conditions right within your district or school to make sure that students get what they need through those really effective intervention programs. So that's the framework. We are couching this conversation within the science of reading. This is a phrase you've probably heard recently. This is not a fad. This is not a buzzword. I really encourage you to go to the whatisthescienceofreading.org website and explore this national definition a little bit more. In fact, sign on to learning this definition, using this definition, and getting updates as additional components of the definition become available. What I want you to think about is the fact that the science of reading is not a single thing. This is a vast body of scientific evidence that crosses countries, languages, disciplines, and really can help inform how we teach reading, how we understand how reading develops for students, and what we might do when things go wrong, when students are not increasing their reading skills and need some intervention. So I'm going to be sharing specifically some ideas that come from empirical or scientific research. So there are different types of research, and I'm going to be focusing on the quantitative, where we are able to control the variables in an experiment, where we can really get to what causes better reading outcomes, where we can have a better leg to stand on, so to speak, in making claims about doing X causes Y, where those kinds of studies have been published in peer-reviewed journals, for example. So that's the very specific type of research that I'm using as the basis for what I'm sharing with you today. So I'm talking about intervention, reading intervention specifically, and this is different instruction from what we think of as good, high-quality classroom instruction. Intervention is different from what we might think of as accommodations or modifications. What we're doing when we intervene is actually entering into the path that the student is on, and we are looking to make a change to that path. We're looking to change the outcome for the student. So that's the specific perspective that I'm going to be taking. So I want to give you several ways of framing your thinking about intervention. And the first sort of framework I want to share with you is this simple view of reading that dates back several decades now, that gives us a way of understanding what contributes to reading comprehension. And it's a simple view, right? There are lots of contributing factors to whether or not a student understands what they read. But the simple view captures lots and lots of variables and puts them into something that we can understand fairly easily and remember. And it's a math problem. So this is saying that what goes into and contributes to reading comprehension can be explained almost entirely in terms of word recognition and language comprehension. Those are two broad components. And almost everything that students need to know to be able to understand what they're reading can be captured in those two components. And it's a multiplication problem. We're not adding the two together. We are multiplying them. We are looking at the interactions between them. It's a reciprocal relationship. And we know that if students are able to instantly recognize words and decode, but they can't understand oral language, they don't have good understanding of syntax or vocabulary, they're not going to understand what they're reading. And also, if they have good oral language, listening comprehension, high vocabulary, but they can't automatically decode, they also will not understand what they read. So both components are essential. And this is what you want to be thinking about as you're building readers, as you're creating readers with your young students, but also when you're looking at students who need intervention. So you have students who are struggling, let's say, with reading comprehension. The broad categories of where you want to look to resolve that reading comprehension problem are in these categories of word recognition and language comprehension. If you want to get a little bit more detail about those component skill areas, I would direct you back to that seminal work, the National Reading Panel Report, and more recently, the IES practice guides. I'm showing the cover here of the one for the foundational skills in kindergarten through 3rd grade. There are others for English learners, for secondary students, and so on. What you'll see in those compilations of the reading research are 2 categories. We're going to talk about these and unpack these a little bit. So what are the skills that we want to look for to be included in interventions that we're selecting and implementing? And what are the instructional approaches, the how should those skills be taught? So let's focus first on what are those essential skills? What are the components that fit within word recognition and language comprehension and build towards reading comprehension? So we're going to talk about these in terms of how you want to see these component skills showing up in intervention materials. So I'm thinking now about the materials you already have, whether those are programs or approaches, and if you're thinking about selecting new intervention materials. So you're looking for these 5 essential or core component skills. And I always think about them separately because they're important separately. These capture large bodies of skill, right? So phonemic awareness is not a single skill, it's a category of skills. But I also like to think about them in sort of a progression. So I'm using this sort of stair-step visual here, that students are acquiring these skills on their route to reading comprehension. They need to have some awareness of the sound structure of language. They need to be able to use that to map to print. They need to be able to automatically and fluently not just recognize words, but read text. And that contributes, along with their their vocabulary and oral language skills, contributes to their reading comprehension. So there's a general or overall progression here. And I think it's helpful to have that kind of that continuum or schema in your mind when you're thinking about intervention. I'm going to return to this sort of framework of essential skills and progression of skills as I go along through this presentation. So young students who are coming into preschool, kindergarten, 1st grade, we're building their skills from the ground up. Older students who might be struggling to understand what they are reading of grade level text, we want to be tracking this progression of skills backwards to get to that root cause of why they are not understanding what they're reading. So let's take each one of these 5 essential skills and give you some very specific components to look for, either in your existing intervention materials or in ones that you might be selecting that might be new for your system. So when it comes to looking at vocabulary intervention, you want to look for there to be extended discussion of new words that's integrated with content learning over time. So intervention materials that integrate around themes, for example, would be something to look for. You want to make sure that students are being exposed to and revisiting words across time and in multiple contexts, that you are seeing evidence of word learning being integrated in places you might not think that it naturally would be, like spelling. We know from the research that when students write out the words that they are learning the meanings of, it helps reinforce that network in their minds. That when they are learning about the sound structure of language, if they're practicing skills like blending and segmenting phonemes with words that are in their oral vocabulary, that will help them accelerate not just their vocabulary learning, but also their phonemic awareness. And during decoding and phonics instruction, when students are building words, let's say, when they know the meaning of those words, when there are opportunities to talk about the meanings of those words, you're building that connection. So look for these when you're looking for or evaluating intervention materials around vocabulary. Phonemic awareness is an area we have lots of research to guide intervention, lots of very specific information that has been tested out and can guide our choices here. So we know that it's important for intervention materials to focus on the phoneme. You're probably familiar with a wide range, even a continuum of phonological awareness skills and phonemic awareness skills, which is that sub-component working at that smallest unit of spoken language. research really points us to working at the phoneme level, not needing to take students through every single prior skill. Try starting right with the phoneme. We also see in the research that it's helpful to narrow the range, to not work on the entire continuum of skills at once, but to focus in on one or maybe two skills that are sort of next to each other in that hierarchy or continuum, really prioritizing blending and segmenting phonemes. Making it concrete for young students or for struggling older students by using movement, clapping parts of words or using some kind of manipulative to make it concrete, and getting the connection to letters as soon as possible. Moving from the speech sounds to the printed symbol as soon as possible, and letting that reciprocal nature, reciprocal relationship between the sound and symbol really accelerate their learning. Integrating the meaning of the words that you're blending and segmenting as spoken activities, oral activities even, accelerates their learning of phonemic awareness. And in the area of intervening with phonemic awareness, we know from the research that small group works best. So whenever possible, intervene in small groups. In terms of phonics instruction, some things to look for in your intervention materials are these terms: explicit, systematic, teacher directed, where we are moving from speech to print. So reading is that language-based skill, and we want to make students very aware of the code, those printed symbols or graphemes that are representing our speech. So where you see in intervention programs a routine, a script, teacher-directed language, that's really a plus. Those kinds of intervention materials are shown to be more effective. When you can find the systematic nature of the phonics instruction, moving students in a very planful way from easier or simpler skills to more complex, and not jumping around in that sequence. When you can find in intervention materials the application of the skill. So not doing phonics as an isolated activity, but seeing it applied in the context of reading and writing. You want to look for that in your intervention materials. Same is true with these other skills. This integration is really important. So not having phonics being separate from your spelling intervention, having that being integrated is what you want to look for. When it comes to building students' oral reading fluency, we have a lot of research on this particular intervention, ways to improve students' fluency once they are accurate readers. And that's really the key that I would encourage you to look for in intervention programs, is the fact that we're not, or let me say it this way, the fact that we want to build fluency with reading text after students are accurate readers. And we need to sort of control that environment for students who are beginning readers or older struggling readers, so that they are having a successful experience reading, and so that the fluency will pave the way for comprehension, which is the ultimate goal of all of these intervention activities. So I would point you to looking for repeated reading when it comes to fluency interventions. This is one that we have the most research on, I would say. There's very specific detail in the research about how to do repeated reading, and look for intervention materials that have specific text that can be used for that fluency practice. When it comes to comprehension, the research is really clear that what we want to look for in intervention materials are these underlying component skills, these processes that contribute to reading comprehension. This is different from what you might think and what you might see in some programs that might not be as effective as strategies. So we want to avoid an over-reliance on intervening on strategies, and try to provide intervention materials and approaches that work on those underlying processes like syntax, grammar, morphology, vocabulary, and teaching students to be able to make inferences. Those are all powerful components for comprehension intervention. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit. And we've talked about what to look for, what skills, what you might see about teaching those skills. Now I want to focus a little bit on how those skills should be taught. And here the reading research is really full of good advice and approaches. So we want to find reading intervention that is explicit and systematic and provided in a nice, neat, and tidy package of a routine. Now, sometimes people think that really, can cramp my style as a teacher. I don't want to have to follow a script or a routine. And I would say that highly skilled teachers are able to bring those routines to life, and they're able to customize those routines for individual students. That's where that individualization comes into play. But the routine helps make sure that we're maximizing every intervention instructional minute, that we are not asking the teacher or the student to figure out what comes next, that we're providing a nice, tidy sequence that builds on itself to make sure we're maximizing the opportunity. Now, these two bullets might seem like they contradict each other, but I really do mean both of these things. You want to look for reading intervention that prioritizes and targets a skill area, one of those 5 essential components that I've shared with you, but that also integrates across those priority skills. Because of the way that the network has to be built in our brains to become skilled readers, we want to make those connections. Like I was sharing about when you're teaching to prioritize phonemic awareness, you're also talking about the meanings of the words that you're blending and segmenting. Looking for opportunities, intervention materials that allow you to apply the skills that students have learned, the skills that they have built, let's say, from the ground up, apply those in real, authentic reading and writing activities. This is a sequence, right? We're not looking for the application first. We're looking for the application at the end of that cycle or routine. So we're supporting students to acquire the skill first. We're looking for them to be accurate in the skill, and then they can apply it to their reading and writing. And so intervention materials should have that sequence very evident and provide materials for doing just that. And then the last sort of element of effective reading intervention that I want to spend a little time on is small group instruction. Small group is really the mechanism. It is the environment for providing reading intervention that will accelerate students' learning. Why is this? This might be intuitive, but I wanted to highlight a couple of elements of small group instruction and intervention, why this is so effective. When we're in small group and students all have the same instructional need, we can really focus in on the next step for their instruction. We're not teaching over their head. We're not teaching something they already know. We're focusing very specifically on what they need to learn next. In a small group, every individual has more opportunities to respond. And the research has been clear for decades that this is one of the components of effective intervention for reading, that we maximize the opportunity for the student to make a response and for the instructor to either affirm that it's correct or to give some kind of corrective feedback, to support the student to make a correct response initially, but if they don't, to be there in that small group to make the correction so that the student is left with the correct response. So that's what's really going to maximize outcomes. In small group, there is the chance for more practice. We know very often students who are having difficulty becoming readers or they're older struggling readers, for them to acquire the new skills will take more practice opportunities than typically what's available in the regular classroom. What is required for some other students to learn the skill, that students are going to need multiple opportunities to practice over time in that kind of cumulative way. So those would be some things I would encourage you to look for in the intervention instruction. Okay, so the other framework that I'd like to share with you, in addition to these concepts around the simple view of reading, would be this idea of creating a host environment in your school that supports effective reading intervention. So this quote comes from some of the origins of the MTSS model, the 3 tiers of instructional support model. And I want to highlight here for you this idea of effective host environments having policies, structures, and routines. Thinking about your school as a system, and is it a place that supports good reading intervention? So a couple of things I want to try to encourage you to think about here. Within the MTSS model, what we're doing is engineering a seamless system of increasingly intensive instructional supports that any student can access from day one arriving in kindergarten. This is a system that allows all students to reach the grade level expectations that we have for them in reading, but what it takes for them to reach those expectations will vary in intensity. That's what this triangle image is about. So we have 3 tiers of prevention, 3 tiers of instruction. That's what the image of this model is communicating. All students are accessing the high quality first reading instruction that we provide in the regular education classroom. It is highly differentiated. It is research-based. We are meeting the needs of most students through the first way that we teach reading. We know that some students are going to need something more, something different to get to those grade level reading expectations. That's where tier 2 or those targeted interventions come into play. So I'm really framing my comments today focused on this idea of tier 2 targeted intervention, or even the tier 3 intensive intervention that some students need to reach those grade level reading expectations. They're still accessing their tier 1 instruction. These are like extra doses or extra dips on the ice cream cone. Students who are at risk are going to need more and better reading instruction in addition to their core reading instruction to get to those same grade level expectations. So as an administrator, there are roles for you around these structures and systems, the policies, the resources, the professional development that you're providing to teachers so that they can provide and offer the full continuum of supports that the students in your system need. We want to get 100% of students to these grade level expectations, recognizing that they're not all going to get there through the same type or amount of instruction. So I want to highlight some of these elements of considerations for implementing effective reading instruction. So I'm going to give you 5 things to think about and just introduce each one of these briefly, and maybe this will stir up some ways of thinking about questions that you have. We're going to save time for questions at the end. So thinking about implementation of reading intervention, I've given you the what to teach, those 5 core components. I've given you some of the structures to look for, the how to teach components of your reading intervention. Now I'd like you to think about the systems that need to be in place to support that good, high quality reading intervention to actually be delivered and to make a difference for students. So 5 considerations. Now, the first one might be unexpected, given that I want to and am focusing on reading intervention. So why is she bringing up focusing on prevention? Well, especially this year, some of you may be experiencing the fact that many of your students, especially in the primary grades, are looking like they need intervention. More students are looking like they're at risk at the beginning of this school year, perhaps than any other school year. And I think this is an important time for us to shift the conceptualization and to remember that in order to provide that increasingly intensive intervention that some students are going to need, we have to get it right in the first reading instruction we provide in Tier 1 or that universal reading instruction. So how do we get the time, the resources, the money, the people to provide the kinds of intensive intervention that some students need? Well, we have to do that by shrinking the number of students who need it, right? So that's what I want you to think about in terms of prevention. We increase the effectiveness of our reading intervention by making sure that we're preventing reading problems for the majority of our students with how we teach reading the first time in Tier 1. Okay, so that's a lot to throw at you to think about, but I want to just put that out there first, because that's really one of the secret components here that I want you to have in mind when you're thinking about intervention, reading intervention. This second idea about teacher knowledge, as I mentioned, is what framed the title for this presentation, coming from the document by Dr. Louisa Moats that I mentioned, and I'll link for you in the resources at the end. I want you to really focus on number 4, number 6, and number 7 here. And as you are thinking about either selecting new reading intervention materials or evaluating the ones that you're using, I want you to have teacher knowledge in mind. One of the best things that you can do is to make a selection of an intervention program or approach that comes with high quality professional development that is ongoing over time, perhaps even including some implementation guidance, some coaching for your teachers. This is what I would encourage you to look for. I see this in programs from Voyager Sopris Learning, for example, like their Passport program. Many of the elements that I've been sharing with you are evident in Passport, but one of the things I like most about it is this opportunity for support for your teachers through professional development, through that implementation support. This is so important. High quality rocket scientist teachers need that level of professional development and support for implementing these really effective intervention materials that you as an administrator can make available for them. So I mentioned in one of my learning intentions that I want to talk with you about matching student needs to the reading intervention. And to do that, your system needs a comprehensive menu of assessments. So on this slide, I'm giving you on the left-hand side some questions that you need assessments to answer about your students. And I'm going to link those to purposes of assessment on the right-hand side. So I want you to think about the fact that when you're selecting reading intervention programs, you're not doing that in a vacuum. It's not about go look at a list online, go ask your neighboring district who seems to be successful, what do they use? But you really have to orchestrate this match between, yes, selecting high quality intervention materials, but knowing very clearly what is it that your students need, and thinking about it as a matching process, right? So that you know what students need specifically in those 5 essential skill areas, and that you can make selections of intervention materials that will meet those needs. So knowing about how many students are at risk is a screening question. You have to have screening assessments in your system. Answering the question about what do your students know and what do they need to learn next, that's a diagnostic assessment purpose. So you also need to have reading diagnostic tools. Is what you're using, is your current instruction or intervention actually working or not? That's a progress monitoring question. And then outcome evaluation is sort of the summative version of this last question. Did your intervention and instruction work for your students? So let me go into a little bit more detail on each one of these assessment purposes, and you can think about your own assessment system. Where do you have good assessment tools that will tell you what intervention your students need And in which of these areas might you have some gaps? That would be the way to think about it. So universal screening is like the check engine light in your car, which mine is currently on. I have an appointment next Monday to take my car in. Just by the check engine light, I don't know what's wrong with my car. It's going to take a mechanic to figure that out, but I know something's wrong. I know I need to take a next step. I know I need to do some additional diagnostics, right? So those brief, reliable, and valid predictive assessments help us to know who may be at risk. It's giving us that first glance picture of, are there students in our system who need instructional support, who might need intervention? How many of them are there? Then we're going to follow that with diagnostic assessment, which is not quick. It's not something we want to do with everyone. It's not as important what the score is. We're interested in a diagnostic assessment that will link directly to instruction, that will put the student on that skill continuum. It'll drop a pin right there. This is the next step for this student. So intervention materials for reading, like Voyager's Passport, that has a placement test, will tell you exactly where to position that student for their reading intervention, so you're not wasting time on things they already know and you're not teaching over their head. So what to intervene on is what you need the diagnostic assessment to answer for you. Progress monitoring assessments have many of the characteristics of screening measures. They're brief, they're standardized, they're reliable and valid. They are those indicators tapping into those essential skill areas. But what makes progress monitoring a little bit different is that it is sensitive to growth over time. There are alternate forms of the same assessment that can be used to measure progress and growth over time. It's just like a GPS for educators. It's that real-time feedback. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we on course to make it to our destination, the reading goal that we have for our student? Is our intervention working for this student? We've gone through all the good work to make a good selection about an intervention program. We've carefully matched it to the needs of our students. Now we need an assessment for progress monitoring to tell us, is this intervention working in real time? This feedback will help us make one of three decisions. Either we're going to continue with that intervention, or we might need to intensify the intervention. We might need a smaller group. We might need a longer instructional dose. We might need more practice opportunities. We might have to intensify support. Or the third option is everything's working. It actually has worked. Student has met their goals. We can fade our support. Without having repeat measurement, ongoing progress monitoring, it's difficult to make those kinds of decisions. Specifically, what your assessment system should be telling you is something like this. You should be able to make a statement like this. Our students in third grade are having difficulty with reading comprehension because 18% of them are missing this word recognition skill. They're missing something about phonics. When we have assessment data that's that specific, it helps us target in and make really good, well-informed instructional intervention choices. So a fourth consideration around implementing reading intervention is to make sure that your schedule is set up in a way that supports enough time for intervention. So this is just a sample. This is nothing set in stone or magical. It's just here to give you an idea of what a primary grade schedule might look like where you're implementing a three-tiered model. And you can see that there are opportunities for tier 2 and tier 3 intervention. And the guidance that I would share with you about this is when you're selecting an intervention program, pay specific attention to how much time the authors of that program say that it will take. And make sure you have created a schedule that allows for that much time to happen each day. This is really important. If you are going to go to all of this effort to make a good selection, if you're going to get the conditions right as a host environment in your school, don't short shrift the amount of time. Figure out how to make that available so that the full intervention program can be delivered as designed. Otherwise, you're not really giving it a fair chance to increase the reading outcomes for your students. This is very tricky. I understand there are lots of moving parts for administrators to create schedules. So I would encourage you to sort of narrow and focus your thinking, if you can, based on your data, your screening data. Is there a grade level where you've got a lot of need? Well, pay particular attention to the schedule in that grade level. Make sure you have sufficient time for reading intervention in that grade level. If you can't make it happen in all grades, prioritize that grade level where a large number of students are struggling. Start there, and then maybe across time you can expand to other grade levels. This is also related to the service delivery approach, and I'm sharing with you an example from a colleague, Sharon Dunn, who has implemented this approach that she's calling walk to intervention. And her example here has about 100 students in first grade with 10 staff members. So I want you to expand your thinking here about who those 10 staff members might be. Classroom teachers, obviously, but any other adults on the payroll, so to speak, who are available in your school. So that might be special educators, it might be reading interventionists, it might be a speech pathologist or a school psychologist, or even a counselor, a social worker, a librarian. I know in some schools they've marshaled the forces of every adult who's available to help support reading instruction. And in this particular case, there was some attention to hiring part-time paraprofessionals and using them very strategically. So the idea here, not to get into the weeds of what this flexible service delivery is about, but high-level thinking that we want to focus intervention support for students based on the skill that those students are missing, not based on the funding stream, not based on the category or label that students have, EL, Title I, special ed, not basing it on the role of the adult or educator, but really focusing in on and targeting the needs of the students. So that's what you see here. It could be maybe in the middle of first grade, where we are sorting out students from 4 homerooms into these 4 basic groups that are targeting the intervention towards the skill that students need. So these students are kind of the farthest along on the instructional continuum. They're working with one teacher. These students are not quite as far along. These here, not as large of a group. We have 2 teachers working with them, so we can reduce that group size, and a paraprofessional shared across these 2 teachers. And then our students who are needing the most support, I've just identified that they're coming from these 4 different homerooms, so to speak, classrooms. There are 2 teachers supporting these 18 students and 2 paraprofessionals. So we can really get the smallest groups available to those most struggling students for their reading intervention and target very specifically on the next steps that they need for their instruction. Okay, so just to summarize some of the big ideas that I have shared with you today, that we want to use the reading research to make selections about reading intervention. We don't have to guess. We don't have to, just throw an arrow at a dartboard. We don't have to just ask our neighbor what they're using. We actually can go to the reading research to inform what causes students to become readers, what is the small list of skill areas that our reading intervention should focus on, what does the reading research tell us about how best to teach those skills that students might be struggling with. So make those decisions grounded in the reading research. Make sure that the interventions you choose are focused on those 5 essential skill areas. that the intervention instruction is explicit and is provided in small group. Even if you have lots and lots of students who need intervention this school year, do what you can to group students according to their skill needs and to get them in the smallest size group that is possible. That reading intervention should be explicit, teacher-directed, teacher-driven, given to students in a supportive way that causes them to produce the skills correctly and then apply them in their reading and writing. And make your school an effective host environment for supporting the reading intervention in the ways that I have shared with you. Get the conditions right in terms of policy, in terms of schedule, in terms of professional development for your teachers, in terms of flexible service delivery, so that you really can maximize the opportunities for students to get what they need as quickly as possible. Here are the resources that I've mentioned with links for you to get to each of these. This is the definition of the science of reading that I encourage you to check out. There is a guide here that you can download. You can sign on, so to speak, to using this definition and share it with people you work with. Here is one good summary of the reading research in a research brief from an entity called EAB. And then here is the rocket science paper from Dr. Moats that inspired the title of this presentation. I think that's an excellent resource for not just seeing a summary of the reading research, but getting those conditions in place, particularly around teacher knowledge, not losing sight of what your teachers need to know and what an investment that is in their professional knowledge so that they can provide effective reading intervention to your students. Okay, I think we're just about at the place where we need to stop and see what questions have come in. So Lori's gonna help me out here with the chat. And if you're still typing, go ahead. We've got a few minutes, so get your question into that, the Q&A section of the panel here.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We did get a few questions here. Hoping a few more trickle in here, but let's start with one of these larger questions here. So I'm sort of combining a few. We many times we hear conversations about the science of reading going hand in hand with equity conversations. Can you talk about how the science of reading can actually help create equity in classrooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we shouldn't leave reading to chance. So I think we have to be mindful of creating the right conditions for all students to become skilled readers. It shouldn't matter where you live. It shouldn't matter which teacher's classroom you end up in. It shouldn't matter. Uh-oh, did I just lose my screen?
No, you're okay.
You're fine.
Oh, so it changed on my view. That's interesting. Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
I can either see what's on my screen or I can see you. I can see both. And so let me see if I can get this.
I'm the better view though, so.
Yeah. So I'm not, am I sharing my screen?
Yes, it's still on the question slide. You're okay.
How about that? Okay, well, I'll just go without being able to see you, Lori.
Sure.
So we shouldn't leave it to chance, and it shouldn't be accidental. Reading instruction needs to be available to every student. It's the reason I went into education, is to change outcomes for students. Schools are the mechanism for lifting all boats, right? It's the reason many of us went into education. And if it is left up to chance, or if it depends on where you go to school or what teacher you have or what your teacher has learned on her own, or which programs your teacher has available to her, or if it depends on you being eligible for some type of service like special education or Title I, if those are barriers to students getting high quality reading instruction that actually causes them to read at grade level, then that presents an equity problem. So I think that's where the science of reading can be that conversation that allows us to have a much more solid basis of understanding and practice that we're applying when we're teaching reading.
This next question dovetails nicely then. So if the science of reading is evidence, and we know, as you just said, you're speaking to equity, and other approaches to literacy instruction don't have that same level of proof, then why aren't all teachers required to learn about the science of reading and its application in structured literacy in their pre-service college courses? What do you think about that?
Well, I think a lot about that. That's actually the direction that I've taken in my career now 30 years in. I've worked in the past a lot with in-service support to teachers, and now I'm shifting to the pre-service realm, because I think that that question points out what we are all recognizing, that we need to prepare teachers effectively the first time around so that districts don't have to spend so much money retooling through professional development, and that we don't have these gaps in knowledge. So the reasons why higher ed hasn't already been on board with using the evidence to prepare teachers to teach reading is an answer that is very complex and probably takes longer than we have. I will just say that there are many reasons why that is. And I will say I'm very hopeful and optimistic that that's changing. I think there are multiple points of influence now putting pressure on higher ed. And there are many of the folks working in higher ed who are understanding their role in the abysmal reading outcomes that we've had in this country. They recognize and take responsibility for their role in contributing to that, and they want to do something different. So there are lots of grassroots initiatives right now that are happening where individual faculty members, where groups of faculty members within different colleges and universities, where state departments of education are now starting to have conversations about what needs to change in higher ed so that we can get this right the first time. I know lots of teachers, I've been an adjunct and now I'm a part-time assistant professor in a reading science training program. Lots of teachers feel a lot of anguish about the way that they were taught to teach reading, the kinds of intervention that they may be provided in the past, and all the students who they don't feel they were effective with because they acted on what they were given in their teacher training program, and it just wasn't adequate. And so now that they know that there's a whole body of research that perhaps was withheld from them, I'm not going to assign intention to that, but that they just weren't aware of. Now that they are aware, they're doing some amazing things to correct that, and seeing a lot of really great progress with their students. So I feel hopeful that we're at a turning point here right now. This is a great time to be working in reading and reading instruction.
Absolutely. You know, when you know better, you can do better. You can't hold it against anyone that they didn't know what they didn't know, but now we do know. So there really is no excuse. We need to follow what science says works.
That's exactly right. And we don't have science to answer every single question. You know, you can't rely on science for every move you make every minute in the classroom, but you can at least leverage what is readily available. And that's what we want to, you know, make more accessible for every educator.
Absolutely. Okay, so the next two are actually more comments or messages, but I thought they would be pertinent to share. So originally, Wendy had asked a question early on in the presentation, you know, for core instruction related to the word recognition block, what do you think about flexing students across grade levels so they get explicit, systematic, and the question goes on. But Stephanie, as you continued your presentation, she says, later on the flexible service delivery slide, she chimes back in and says, this is what I was talking about. The walk to intervention Stephanie is describing is what I was referring to, but as a walk to read for the word recognition core instruction block. So I'm bringing that up just to sort of show how we're on the same page. And based on your presentation, you're already anticipating the questions that people are going to ask.
Yeah, and I heard something in Wendy's question. So yeah, we are lined up for sure, because I think that's the structure, that flexible service delivery, walk to read, walk to intervention. That's the structure that you have to make it practical to accomplish targeting at the student's next step for instruction. But the piece that I heard was about cross grades, and I want to just give a caution about that. Just because of the social aspect of doing that. So in some primary grades, it's not a problem. Kindergarten to first grade, kids mix. They don't know that they're, with a mixed group of students. They're not as aware. There's not the stigma that's attached to it. When you get into the intermediate grades, I think you have to really be cautious about that, because kids pick up on the group that they're in, and there can be some social stigma attached to that. So I just want to raise that as a caution when you're doing that flexible grouping. Within
Fair
grade
point.
might work better.
Okay, let's see. This next comment here, I like to share the comments as well as the questions. So we got this private message. Thank you for all this information. We have been studying the science of reading and have had letters training. This has been extremely beneficial in building teacher knowledge that can be applied throughout the day and across content areas. Absolutely. The thing that I draw to here is across content areas, because when you can read, you can do anything.
It's the foundation of doing just about anything. And certainly it's the foundation of academic success across the content areas. I'm in letters training myself right now, for the third time. So I guess that either means I didn't get it right the first two times. No, it means I really like letters training. So I'm in the third edition right now, and we have this really wonderful approach here in Ohio where folks in higher ed like myself can partner with districts to go through letters training. And I love that model because they are the ones in the classroom applying the information, like it sounds like the person who sent this comment is doing. So that's exactly the right approach. Taking new knowledge, new learning about the reading research, like what you get in letters, and seeing how that applies across the content areas, really supporting all of your teachers to understand that they have a role as being a reading teacher, even if they on paper are the science teacher or the social studies teacher or even the math teacher. So I'm really thrilled that participant is participating in letters, because it's been a treat for me too, for sure.
Great. All right, this is going to be the last question here.
Okay.
So Stephanie, as you said, it is an exciting time to be in reading. A lot is changing and there's a lot of opportunity. Regarding the science of reading as a movement, what have we learned and what do we still need to learn? And if I could be so bold as to add some color to this, I know what we talk about a lot is the science of reading. That evidence base is based on monolingual learners. So a lot of what we're doing now is incorporating a sociocultural approach. Do you think you could talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that has relevance in almost all of the findings from the reading research, because reading is a language-based skill. So language is a socio-cultural construct, right? So when we are improving students' language capabilities, that's the foundation for reading. So one of the most important findings of the reading research is that reading is not natural. It's not something we are hardwired or born to do. The circuits that have to be created for reading to happen are created through experience and instruction. And that's what we're doing in education, is making that happen. So rather than sitting back and waiting for it to happen, waiting for the student to be somehow developmentally ready for it to happen, waiting for it to click in naturally, we now know that we have to actually guide and influence that happening And we know a great deal about how to create those instructional environments to make it happen more efficiently and more effectively. There's a lot we don't know. As I mentioned, we're learning all the time. And I encourage teachers to collect their own evidence, like I was mentioning about progress monitoring, so that you're doing little experiments with the students. I hope that doesn't sound bad, but you're doing experiments about your instruction. Is it working? Is it not working? What do I need to change in an ongoing way?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stoller. So we're at the top of the hour, so that's going to conclude today's presentation. Thank you to Dr. Stoller for her time and expertise. And of course, thank you to all of you for attending today. Until next time, take care, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. And even though we are at the top of the hour, if there are any questions that we didn't get to today, I'm sure that our partners over at Voyager Sopris Learning will be willing to get back to your questions individually after today's webinar. And thank you again to Stephanie for your time here today and Lori for facilitating. Our audience appreciates it as well. Speaking of audience, I would just like to thank our attendees for joining us today. For those who enjoyed our presentation, you'll be pleased to know there are many more upcoming web seminars like this one that are provided by District Administration, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, and current issues in K through 12. Our wide range of readers at DA subscribe for free, and they stay up to date with us through our print magazine, our newsletters, and web seminars like this one. Also, for those of you who'd like to watch this web seminar again, or for those of you who believe that the solutions provided today would be helpful, you'll be pleased to know that our team at DA, they'll be sending you an email later tomorrow with an on-demand recording of this web seminar and the link to the slides. So with that, on behalf of DA, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone. Take care, be well, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.